Okay, welcome everybody to Merry Musings number 9. This one is on thought. I've been doing a lot of thinking about thought, and particularly this question on the transcendence of our experience of thought as linear. So as in some of the earlier Merry Musings, we're going to kind of trace the evolution of thought as a concept over time, and then look at where are we now and where do I feel we're going next. So these are just some of the books that have inspired this. Obviously the Bowman Krishnamurti work on this, and Nishad's book, which has his the transcript of his conversation with David Bohm on a number of these topics. This fantastic book by Stephen Harrod Buna, it's on a lot more than plant intelligence. It's really, on the whole way we perceive and engage the world. So he's put lots of subtitles in there, all of which are true, Beyond the Doors of Perception. So I drew a lot from him, as we'll see shortly. And then a book that I'm still reading, which is Bob Jahn and Brenda Dunn's book about the work they did at Princeton, showing how human intention affects otherwise random events. And after their 28 years of research, they, as good scientists, looking at the data, they questioned their framework, their theoretical framework and understanding of reality, and said, well, if this is the data we're getting, how would we create a theory that explains what it is that we're seeing? So that's where we're going to end, as I'm going to share with you some of their insights from there. So thought, and I like this Edward de Bono quote at the top, most of the mistakes in thinking are inadequacies of perception rather than mistakes of logic. Inadequacies of perception. So that brings us to the question of how does perception evolve? And for those who are not familiar with this model on the screen now, this is the model of spiral dynamics, developed initially by Clare Graves and then worked out further by Dr. Dombeck and Chris Cowan. And it describes the individual and collective development of humanity over time. So we each go through these phases individually from the moment we're born, but humanity has also gone through these phases collectively. And as we go through them, they are really lenses on the world, or Dombeck often describes them as coping mechanisms, ways we've learned to cope with the world around us. And each new stage transcends but includes the previous stage if it is in a healthy development, and therefore becomes more encompassing and more complex as it evolves, because each new one contains the previous one, so it contains more of reality, as it were. And so as thought has evolved, thought has also evolved, I'm proposing, through these different phases. But I've broken these phases down into 3 main phases that are also reflected in the evolution theory work. The first is at the instinctive level, where thought as such, abstract thought as such, doesn't really exist. It's purely awareness in the moment. 2, our linear abstract thought that we're familiar with at the moment. 2, what I would call, therefore, volutionary, as there's not really language for it, or translinear, which you could call it, but that's in a way that name is determined by the previous level. So what would it be in its own right? So we're going to look at these 3 phases of how thought has evolved over time. And one of the important points here is to notice how there's a relationship between these different systems. So the central 4 systems are all part of this linear perspective. And yet the top 2 and the bottom 2 are, although different, related, because both of them are non-linear. But you could say that the earlier two, so the beige and purple systems, are prelinear, and the top two systems translinear. You'll also notice that they both have the words internal on them compared to the central ones that are labeled as external, because the primary foundation for the experience, our experience of the world in the bottom two and top two systems, is an internal reference point. It's an experience of the world around us, whereas the primary reference point for the central four systems is external. It's about understanding and analysis more of the world out there rather than of the world in here. So, to dive into the first two phases, the internal, which could be described as pre-rational, instinctive, or also has been described as analogical knowing. And we'll come to a description of that in a second. But it's really before the emergence of rational abstract thought in hunter-gatherer communities. It was more an instinctive knowing of the world around us without a conversation or an objectification of it, without therefore a kind of reflection on it, which is what came next. So, drawing a lot from the Buhner work here, he says, throughout human habitation of Earth, millions of people have used this innate capacity of recognizing whole systems instinctively. So he describes it, recognizing whole systems instinctively, instant knowing. Millions of people have used this to gather information from the heart of the world. I just need to move this bar here that's rather irritatingly in the way. It is what all deep earth people have done throughout time, from the indigenous peoples who learned the uses of plant medicines without recourse to reductionism or linear thinking, through to Einstein. What they describe is in fact a different kind of thinking. The kind of thinking that Einstein was urging us to adopt in order to address the problems facing us. And rather than being linear, reductive thinking, what occurs in holistic thinking is a kind of thinking that the artists who best know it have named analogical thinking. Now, obviously, in a way, it's hard to describe pre-rational thinking or knowing in a rational, through rational thought, which is why there's a bit of a jarring sometimes, but this is an attempt to do it, essentially. So he goes on, however, when analogical thinking is combined with the experience that the ancient Athenians called aesthesis, sense perception, something unusual begins to occur. So this analogical thinking combined with perception through the senses. As the emotion of the self deepens, you begin to go much further than the organism or the phenomena that you have been focused on. You begin to access the metaphysical background, not of one thing, but of all things, of the earth itself. There are moments then of unique insight, moments when great things catch us up in their grasp and take us trembling and awed to the shores of another land. We break through and directly begin to perceive the underpinnings of the world. Albert Einstein talked about the importance of feeling, recognizing that it was only this capacity for feeling the patterns that could enable one to travel deeper into the metaphysical background of the world. Linear reductionism would never get that. There is no logical way to the discovery of these elemental laws. there is only the way of intuition, which is helped by a feeling for the order lying behind appearance. So Boon are really pointing to how if you focus in this kind of analogical thinking, when you focus on one thing and then you allow more of felt perception of this thing to enter rather than a analytical focus, so almost a softening of the gaze and more of a heart-based feeling, then it opens you into a world behind this object that you're looking at, a pattern, a metaphysical reality behind it. So, oh, Kaylin's joining us. So, so this is like the this analogical phase that we've just looked at. A couple of other quotes on this. From Henry Boertoft, quoted in the Booneboek. The aim is to think about the phenomenon concretely in imagination. Goethe referred to this discipline as recreating in the wake of ever-creating nature. Recreating in the wake of ever-creating nature. Combined with active seeing, it has the effect of giving thinking more the quality of perception and sensory observation, more than the quality of thinking. The purpose is to develop an organ of perception which can deepen our contact with the phenomena in a way that is impossible by simply having thoughts about it and working it over with the intellectual mind. So likewise to the previous descriptions, you have to be able to go beyond the initial cognitive perception of it, and in a way allow that to sink to the background to enable a richer perception of the phenomena that then opens a gateway into the reality beyond it, as described on the previous one. And Boon are quoting Bly here, when Robert Bly says, when a poet creates a true image, he is gaining knowledge. He is bringing up into consciousness a connection that has been forgotten, perhaps for centuries. He's talking about what artists have called analogical thinking. So this reference to something that's been forgotten for centuries, we could link to these two earlier phases of development that are these pre-rational but instinctive knowing that in its foundation experienced reality is interconnected, that indeed particularly in the Western civilization we've forgotten, which, as you've heard me talk about before, I believe is really the core of the challenge we're facing. He goes on to say, analogical thinking is the kind of cognition that occurs when you think through your sympathetic perceiving, headed towards a goal, feeling into and attempting to understand some part of the living world that has captured your attention, caught up in what you were doing, right? So no longer not thinking about what you're doing, but immersed and caught up in it. You literally become immersed in your synesthetic sensing and in your search for understanding. When there is submersion to the point where all sense of self fades, you are in analogical thinking automatically. So this relates also closely to the Bohm and Krishnamurti work, where the sense of separate self is so closely defined with logical thinking. And here again, it's that moment when that sense of separation, that sense of separate self, dissolves and puts you in a direct relationship in a way with the reality around us, that you're in what they would call this analogical thinking mode. So that's what we might see as, and be a way to describe these earlier phases of development. Now, obviously, rational linear thought is something we're very familiar with. And as I've said before, in itself is a healthy, positive development. The ability for life to develop a sense of separate self. So to be able to see itself, look at itself, perceive the world around it in the way that happens when the ego emerges in this red individuation phase. At that point, that rational linear thought also emerges, of course, because it's only when the sense of separation happens that that you get I able to see it first and third person emerge. Before that, they're collapsed. So at the same time those emerge, that's in itself a positive development. The problem comes when the earlier phases are repressed rather than included in the development. So when that individuation phase happens, if we forget or bury or push away or lose the 3 million years of development in which we had a direct perception of the interconnectedness of reality, then that sense of separateness emerges in a vacuum. That sense of linearity and rationality emerges unrooted from the foundational experience of interconnectedness that we just described at the earlier phases. So that's why there's been, in a way, so much criticism of it from the consciousness world, or the world of personal development, because of the split that occurred and the need to therefore, in a way, get beyond rational linear thought. Part of my suggestion is getting beyond it means we also need to go back to those pre-rational ways of knowing to be able to integrate that. So many of these points here, this one from David Bohm, for example, thought attributes itself to anything, and this affects how you perceive things. Right? So the very fact of thought, boom, attributing itself, me, it, third person, that's the fundamental mistake, said Bohm, that sense of separation, right? Out of context of the underlying interconnectedness. Krishnamurti, so long as the thinker exists apart from his thoughts, which he is trying to dominate, there can be no fundamental transformation. So as long as there is that experience of separation between the thinker and the thought, then there's not going to be any change, because we're going to be stuck essentially in these central four systems with the linearity and the sense of separation. And Bohm again, when we're thinking about it, rather than contacting it, so contacting it was what we were describing just now in the analogical phase. When we're thinking about it rather than contacting it, we are separating the observer and the observed by the introduction of time, and we are not in the now. For those of you who tuned into the time talk, the idea of that linear time going hand in hand with the separation of space, because as soon as you separate things in space, it takes time to get from one to the other, time for light to travel between them. And so at the moment that we have that separation of the observer and the observed, we introduce time as well. And that takes us out of the now, right? Out of the present moment. The present moment is where we're really able to be in contact, direct contact with, one could say, the analogical thinking. It's a longer one from Bohm here. What is the source of all this trouble? And all the trouble he's talking about with Krishnamurti is around human suffering, you know, all the pain and suffering we cause to each other and to the rest of life around us. What's the source of this? I'm saying that the source is basically in thought. I'm saying the reason we don't see the source of our problems is that the means by which we try to solve them are the source. So if we're trying to solve the problems of thought through thought, then we're not going to get anywhere. That may seem strange to somebody who hears it for the first time, because our whole culture of prides itself based on the thought as its highest achievement. I'm not suggesting that the achievements of thought are negligible. There are very great achievements in technology and culture and various other ways, but there is another side to it, which is leading to our destruction, and we have to look at that. And my proposal is it's the lack of integration, or more actively, the repression of those earlier phases of development, of the sense of direct experience of interconnectedness, that is creating that destructive side. an interesting point here as well. Environmentalism has failed for the same reasons that science is failing. Reliance on the associative mentation, by which he means this rational linear thought. So if the fundamental issue is the loss of an understanding and experience of interconnectedness that can't be felt through the use of rational thought, then in an environmentalism that attempts to argue its cases through the method of rational thought is going to fail at the fundamental level of restoring that interconnectedness. And Buhner saying that's also the core of, why, let's say, mainstream science is also failing us. So we've had the kind of pre-rational analogical. We've had the logical rational that we're most familiar with. So what happens as we push beyond that? And as I've suggested before, that means an integration of the pre-rational first two systems, the rational level, but then that becomes something with different emergent qualities at the next level, at the next phase, in what I would call the evolutionary or translinear thought. So Buhner, we come to sense at this stage the movements of these invisibles through deeper perceptual capacities. We feel their movements in our subconscious, and that part of us acts to inform our anticipatory decisions. We feel their movements in our subconscious. That means we become aware. We're aware of their movements in the subconscious, and that informs our decisions. There is no way to hold all the linear details in the mind and to respond from linear cause and effect in this process. We create our library of feelings, and at a certain point, enough data exists that the deep self can begin to generate informed responses out of it. Now, for me, this is hugely recognizable from times when we were working here in the Netherlands with the Center for Human Emergence, primarily out of this ELO integral perspective, where we were trying to work on big complex challenges. It was a Millennium Development Goals on maternal and newborn health. We had 20 organizations that we were trying to organize to engineer them into a collaborative partnership so that they would work together to make a positive impact on the world. And what we realized through that experience was that these systems are just way too complex for the rational mind to be able to grasp, and therefore for the mind to be able to understand enough of it to make well-informed decisions. And this is what really pushed us in our inquiry beyond the yellow into the turquoise holistic perspective, because we realized literally this point that you couldn't hold all the linear details in mind, and therefore you couldn't respond from that perspective, that there had to be what we described as a simplicity, the other side of that complexity. That is more this final sentence here, this library of feelings, of intuitive knowings that build up somehow until at a moment you feel, okay, the clarity, as it were, the insight, as Krishnamurti would call it, drops in. In the work of the dialogues between Bohm and Krishnamurti, they talk about this concept of proprioception, and this is the link here is to a blog, somebody writing about it. He calls it the movement of thought could be self-aware without bringing in a self who is aware of it. Like a koan, contemplate that for a minute. Movement of thought could be self-aware without bringing in a self who is aware of it. So yeah, it's just this kind of, in a way, an impersonal, transpersonal sense of knowing. It's Krishnamurti says, thought is an inactivity of the brain. Thought is an activity of the brain, whereas intelligence depends upon the inactivity or the quietness of the brain. So one of the things we practice when doing energetic work is quieting the rational analyzer, as we describe it. So to be able to access the intuitive knowing when we're dowsing, or trying to pick up information more from the information fields through the intuitive knowing, then we have to quieten down the analytical mind. We'll often use an exercise where you start with a high tone and kind of imagine it spinning fast and then moving ever more slowly. So it would kind of go from and whenever I do that now, it kind of relaxes the analytical mind and therefore creates space more for the intuitive mind. Okay, so I want to share this as one example of how some people have tried to make sense of what might be this next level of understanding thought and consciousness. And this comes out of the work, as I said at the beginning, by Brenda Dunn and Bob Jahn, 28 years of research at Princeton University, where they were looking at the role of intuitive knowing in influencing the world around us, and intention, conscious intention. And they gathered all this data over those years that showed beyond statistical doubt that human intention affects otherwise random events, and also that people can pick up information from the field, as it were, outside of time and space. So, for example, when they were doing the remote perception experiments, they had one person looking to pick up the information that somebody else was looking at. So somebody on the other side of the world was going to go and look at an object, and then the recipient, as it were, was to try to just pick up what it is they were looking at. Now, that's been done a few times before, was actually used a lot in the Cold War as to try to work out at different geographic coordinates what either the Russians or Americans had underground at different places. But this one, interestingly, part of the experiment they did was to do it outside of time. So they had the person who was meant to be receiving the information tune in at some point, and all they were given was the name of the person who was going to look at the object. That was it. They weren't told when or where they were or anything else, just the name of the person. And then after the person had tried to pick up that information, a day after, the person actually went to look at the object they were meant to be looking at. And the hits were statistically highly significant. So clearly the person who was receiving the information was picking up that information even before, in a linear time concept, the person had looked at it. So that kind of blows our Newtonian worldview out of the water. And being good scientists, what Brenda Dunn and Bob Jahn did was sit down and go, okay, if we're getting this kind of data from both how human intention seems to be affecting the way randomness shows up, or how we're able to pick up information outside of time and space, how do you create an understanding, a model, a theory that better reflects that that reality that the data is providing us with? And this is what they came up with. On the left side, kind of the mind, on the right, matter. Conscious mind on the one hand, tangible world on the other, unconscious mind, and then intangible, implicate information. So for those of you who are familiar with Ken Wilber's work, you might recognize some patterns here. You just need to turn Wilber's quadrants on its side, and what you notice is that on the left you've got the individual, or the perceiver, the mind, the perceiver of the world around them, and on the right you've got the exterior, the collective aspect, where you've got the world out there, essentially the world of information, the world of the tangible world. But the intangible is invisible, as is the unconscious mind invisible. You can't just look at it and study it through physics or science. Whereas with the exterior, the conscious mind and the tangible world, these are things that you can study in the traditional sciences. So I'll show you what they were suggesting. This is what we might call the normal world, where our conscious mind with its rational thought is observing the world, the tangible world of energy and matter around us, and there's an exchange between the two. But the data they were getting was showing that you could also pick up other information that didn't follow the rules of the normal. And so what they're proposing is that the conscious mind drops into the unconscious mind that enables access to the world of intangible or implicate information that is pulling, as it were, reflecting patterns in the tangible world. But at this level of the unconscious mind and intangible information, space and the rules of separate space and time break down. There's a different set of rules that apply. So at the top two quadrants, the rules of Newtonian physics would apply. From a physics perspective, the bottom two would be more quantum physics, but they would also reflect the discoveries around consciousness, essentially, and what goes on in those invisible realms. In their book, Science and the Consciousness and the Source of Reality, they describe it very succinctly in this way. It's an indirect exchange of information between the tangible physical world, the upper right here, and an interacting consciousness, upper left, so you looking at the world. But you can get an indirect exchange via unconscious interactions, lower left, with an intangible physical domain. So how did the person outside of time, how did the person pick up information about the thing that somebody was going to be looking at tomorrow? They did it by relaxing their conscious mind, which enabled them access to the unconscious mind, which meant that they were able to find the information that exists outside of linear time and space about the thing in the tangible world that the viewer was going to be looking at tomorrow, as it were. This was a really interesting point. Because they were in Princeton University in the engineering department, and they were trying to meet all the demands of the scientific community in terms of their experiments. And they say all our efforts to establish defensible and quantitative analytical techniques have helped to validate the remote perception phenomena, but carried to excess, they appear to have progressively suffocated its emergence. What they found is that as they defined more and more the things they wanted to measure in these experiments, got more granular, more focused, more kind of polar, as it were, in terms of was it this or was it that? They found that the phenomena themselves showed themselves less, appeared less. So the lens with which they were measuring or viewing the experiment seemed to be affecting the experiment itself, which from a quantum physics perspective, where of course it's about the observer influencing the world of the observed, shouldn't be a surprise. But from our traditional scientific perspective, it's a challenge, because science in its normal route wants to be able to create clear parameters of measurement and get more and more specific about things to be able to measure it more and more clearly. But what you find when you do that is that you limit the scope of what you can perceive with that approach to what here is described as the normal. to the world of the conscious mind and the tangible world. And yet all of this data, as well as of course experiences over hundreds of years of traditions, showing that there is another dimension of reality that this approach is not able to grasp. And so for them to have tested this and gone through this process of trying to make things more closer, as it were, more specific to the scientific norms, finding that doing that actually changed the impact of the experiments, so that the anomalous features were reduced as they started to try to measure things in a more separated way. Because what you're trying to do is apply a lens of separation, definition, and distinction to a reality of interconnectedness and complementarity. And the lens just doesn't fit that reality. There have to be different ways of knowing to be able to measure, as it were, that that dimension. Let me just go back to that, just say one other thing on that first. What they found is that they had to keep in the experiments a certain amount of uncertainty and vagueness for it to be able to reveal itself. So in terms of the approach of the remote perceivers who were trying to pick up the information, kind of blank slate of not knowing, of not even expecting a positive result from the experiment, a sense of playfulness or lightness or creativity. All of that helped to be able to achieve the effects that they were looking for. So in a much more right brain activation than left brain activation, in a way you could say, their focus on attempting to bring more left brain into it, in a way excluded the right brain experiences from their perception. A fascinating point, I thought. So their conclusion also was that underlying this, because one of the things they noticed was that there seemed to be patterns across the tangible world, the conscious mind, and they were seeing relationships between these, correlations between the experiences in the conscious mind and between the phenomena that they were picking up in the tangible world. You could say, you know, people have written, is it the Woolley Masters book? I can't remember his name now, but where he talks about quantum physics on the one hand and consciousness and spirituality on the other hand, that there seem to be correlations between them. And so they dealt with that by saying that both of these domains must come, therefore, from the same source, from this field of unified field or field of consciousness, which they initially named the subliminal seed domain, it being the seed of the realities that we experience around us, and later simply went on to call the source. So we are proposing that it is this homogeneous, deepest layer of you and I that provides the medium for anomalous passage of information from the mental side to the material side, or vice versa. Or perhaps more aptly, it provides the gestation site for some embryonic pre-information commodity down at the source that connects both tangible events and conscious experiences. Given this common origin, these palpable events and experiences can collectively display inherent correlations. So this is how they would explain that all of these testers attempting to influence whether a line goes up or down on a computer, or attempting to influence the distribution of 9,000 table tennis balls or polystyrene balls that they drop down a distribution machine. that the reason people were able to succeed in that, in a way that traditional Newtonian science can't explain, is because the conscious mind was relaxing into the unconscious mind and was sending the information into the intangible implicate order, as Bohm would say, and that was coming back into the tangible world. And likewise, going the other way, the information, let's say, flowing from the thing that the person was looking at, from the remote perception, was registered in the intangible implicate information fields, and the viewer was able to retrieve that by going into their unconscious mind and retrieve it outside of time and space, to be able to perceive things in a way that can't be explained through the use of our normal five senses. So just to wrap it up, thought this was a nice quote on, that kind of pulled it all together. Warren Kenton on the Kabbalist practice of integration. This process is nothing less than to integrate the body, soul, and spirit, and so become a finer instrument whereby the inner and outer worlds can come into communion, which is just what we were describing. We're starting to discover at this trans-rational evolutionary level that this is where the inner and outer worlds can come into communion. Each time this is done, the universe comes increasingly into focus as a reflection of the absolute. So that work, let's say, that Brenda and Bob done, that description that they gave us, any of the work that we do in this domain, Kenton is describing as bringing the universe increasingly into focus as a reflection of the absolute. So on the one hand, we have the oneness. On the other hand, we have the many as it comes into focus. But we increasingly come to see how that many is also a reflection of the absolute.